Over the years, I've covered a lot of serial killer stories online, some of the most prolific killers in recent history. Harold Shipman, Samuel Little, John Wayne Gacy, so many more. But one name often goes under the radar, and that is Giulia Tofana. She's suspected of killing more than 600 men in Italy in the 17th century. She is one of the most infamous female poisoners in history. And her story, or her suspected story, I should say, is fascinating. Was she a villain or was she a hero? In 17th century Italy, hundreds of women were suspected of murdering their husbands, but not out of malice, out of necessity. In this time, women had very little agency. Their choices in life were to either get married and hope your husband was a good person, or you could remain single and have no money, no standing in society, likely having to turn to sex work just to survive. Or you could have the best of both worlds and become a widow. Women didn't have ways to escape violent or oppressive marriages in a world where they didn't have legal or sexual autonomy. They couldn't divorce their husbands and they were treated as property, so what came to happen when they wanted or needed to leave? Well, it just wasn't an option. If their husbands died, well, their social standing would remain, they would have money, and they would be safe. And that's when so many women turned to Giulia Tofana and her famous poison, Aquatana. This was the only way that desperate women in this time could have any control over their own lives. For centuries, women's autonomy has been something society has tried to take away. Autonomy over their relationships, their safety, even their pleasure. But today, luckily, we're in a better position. We still don't have true equality, true bodily autonomy, but we're finally starting to reclaim the conversation, little bit by little bit. I am a big advocate of celebrating our bodies, celebrating our sexualities, and that is why I'm very proud to partner with Lilo today, a brand that puts confidence and pleasure, quite literally, back in our own hands. Masturbation, self-pleasure is still thought of as taboo by so many people, but it's very natural, it's very healthy to want to connect with your own body and find out what makes you feel good. And Lilo isn't just another toy brand, it is the toy brand, it is the best toy brand with luxury designs, premium quality and innovative tech. There are no gimmicks, it's just pleasure that's elevated, intentional and sleek. You can see and feel the thought that Lilo puts into every single toy and giving you the most pleasure possible. And today I want to talk to you about the Lilo Switch, a double-ended wand vibrator designed for dual sensations and deep stimulation. There's a powerful vibrating head on one end and a textured insertable tail on the other, with each end having its own motor for strong vibrations exactly where you want them. It has 10 modes and 16 intensities, so you can adjust the toy to exactly what feels good for you. The Lilo Switch is truly unlike anything else in the market, so if you want to give it a go or try literally anything else from the brand, it is all amazing. You can use my code GF15 for 15% off, and this can be applied to anything on the website, including Black Friday sale items. The link is in the top line of my bio, so please go and click on it. Spoil yourself. You deserve it. Have fun. Okay, Giulia Tofana. As is the case with so many historical stories, there are so many different accounts of her life online. Each historian has a slightly different version of events, and truthfully, no one really knows much about Giulia's life, so I'm simply going to do my best here. There were two scholars in the 19th century who dedicated a lot of their careers to tracing the poison Aquatana to its origins, and both of these scholars do tend to agree that the Tofana family had its origins in Sicily. Giulia Tofana was likely just one of a group of poisoners and wise women who sold their poisons throughout Italy for about 30 years. It's thought that Giulia Tofana was born in 1620 in Palermo on the island of Sicily in Italy. You know the bit that looks like Italy's boot is kicking? That's Sicily. We don't know for sure who her parents were, but it is widely speculated that she was the daughter of a woman called Tofana di Adamo, who was another very infamous Palermo poisoner. It was very common in this time to take your parents' first name as a surname, hence the connection. That's why researchers think the two are connected. The fact that Giulia Tofana and Tofania seem to have very similar career paths also link them, but also there are an equal amount of historians who think they might have had no connection whatsoever. We simply don't know. On the 12th of July 1633, when Giulia would have been only around 13 years old, Tofana was executed in Sicily for either murdering her own husband or for distributing poison. According to records from this time, Tofania's poison would kill its victims within just 3 days, and she also had an accomplice, Francesca Lasada. The pair are thought to have had quite a successful operation in Sicily for a long time before they were eventually caught. Tofania's execution was brutal. She was either hung, drawn and quartered, or she was put into a cloth sack, still alive, and then thrown from the roof of the palace. Either way, it was a very violent execution, meant to send a message to other women considering either buying the poison or selling poison. Just don't. It's thought that around this time, or maybe just before she was caught, her rumoured daughter Giulia fled Sicily for the mainland with many of her mother's accomplices, with something very important in her pocket: her mother's poison recipe for Aquatana. The next time there seems to be recorded use of this poison is in Naples in 1643, so it's thought that Giulia ended up around there before heading on to Rome, where she continued her trade, likely trading poisons, Aquatana, behind the facade of running an apothecary shop. One of the aforementioned scholars, basing his work on old court records, states that Giulia arrived in Rome around 1650, with a much younger woman called Girolama Spara or Geronima Spana, depending on which source you believe. Apparently they fled Naples after a poisoning went wrong, so set up shop in Rome instead. As with everything in this tale, there's a lot of legend around Girolama Spara as well, as we'll call her, and whilst we don't know the exact relationship between Giulia and Girolama, many historians do suspect that Girolama was either Giulia's daughter or maybe stepdaughter. It's suspected that Giulia may have been married twice, one of whom was to a man called Niccolo Spara. Girolama was his daughter, and then after he died, Giulia took on her care, and then she remarried to another man once she was in Rome. So once there in Rome after fleeing Naples, the pair soon created a new band of poisoners, poison makers and saleswomen. It was an entirely female-run business. Rumours were that the group would obtain their arsenic supply from a priest, a Father Girolamo of St. Agnes, and that is what they would use as the base for their wares. Now, Aquatana is a name so powerful that you've probably heard of it without having ever heard the story behind it. This has been a poison so feared throughout history that even Mozart on his deathbed said, "I feel definitely that I will not last much longer. I am sure that I have been poisoned. I cannot rid myself of this idea. Someone has given me Aquatana and calculated the precise time of my death." This was in autumn 1791, some 150 years after Giulia, and he had fallen deathly ill with little explanation. In Mozart's mind, Aquatana was the only possible reason. Such was the fear it struck in people, particularly in men. Now, we don't know the cause of Mozart's death today. It could have been anything. We know he had a high fever, and historians have speculated wildly, but it's not thought that he was actually poisoned. But we don't know that for sure. You see, Aquatana was/is a totally tasteless, colourless poison liquid, easily mixed in with food or drink. It was a slow poison that could be microdosed. A small amount given each day would mimic the symptoms of common illnesses like influenza, until eventually the person consuming it would die. The first dose might cause the sniffles, a second would cause bad stomach cramps, maybe vomiting, dysentery, extreme thirst. Each subsequent dose would cause increasing sickness until eventual death. And in the 17th century, it was pretty hard to prove that a death wasn't caused by one of the many fatal diseases that people face every single day. I mean, this was the 17th century. Hygiene wouldn't have been what it was today. They had no understanding of germ theory. Diseases killed people every single day, and they didn't really ever know what they were. Or at least I should say they didn't know what caused the illnesses. At the time, this poison was a massive mystery, and it still kind of is today. Nobody knows what the exact composition was. Due to the documented symptoms, we know it was primarily made with arsenic and likely a combination of lead and belladonna as well, but we don't know the ratios. It was never documented for obvious reasons. This recipe was likely whispered between women, between the poisoners. There are a couple of sources as well which suggest a possible fourth ingredient, maybe solamato or mercury chloride, But we still don't know for sure. As far as my research tells me, nobody's ever been able to successfully recreate Aquatana. Or I suppose that even if somebody did recreate it, there's no way of knowing for sure that it was perfect. A lot of sources will say that Aquatana was often sold under the guise of cosmetics, face creams or oils bought from women in apothecary shops. At face value, they just sold beauty products. To those in the know, it was a lot darker, or brighter, depending on what you needed this poison for. These bottles of Aquatana reportedly matched other cosmetic bottles at this time. Women could very easily stick them on their vanities and not raise any questions. I suppose that's the more attractive version of events, the idea of a femme fatale, a woman surreptitiously disguising poison among her beauty products. But it's much more likely that the poison was actually hidden in a glass flask under the guise of being manna of St. Nicholas. From what I can gather, manna was/is a religious thing. It was called an oil in the time, but it was apparently actually just transparent pure water that formed in St. Nicholas's tomb. People would bottle this up and sell it as a religious thing. Catholics loved it. Apparently the bones of St. Nicholas, Father Christmas's bones, have always mysteriously leaked. I don't know, that sounds like an episode for another time. I do want to delve into that further. This doesn't feel like the time. The legend goes that women would arrive at Giulia Tofana's door and ask for Aquatana, and she would gladly oblige. This was a rough time to be a woman. I mean, it was rough to be a woman throughout most of history, but the 17th century, women had almost no legal rights in this time. They were considered property of the men they were tied to. This was a time dominated by the patriarchy and strict social hierarchies. You could probably still argue that now is still dominated by the patriarchy and strict social hierarchies, but it was even worse in the 17th century. As a result, marriages were often arranged in this time for social and or financial reasons, most often by women's parents trying to get the best life possible for their daughters. Women were legally and economically dependent on their husbands. This was a life sentence. Would there have been some happy marriages as a result of this arrangement? I'm sure there were, but there would have been just as many, if not more, very unhappy marriages thanks to this huge power imbalance. Women would not have been considered as equal to men, and their legal identities would have been essentially absorbed into their husbands the moment they married them. A woman's husband controlled her finances, her choices, her body, and this was true across most of the Western world, but particularly in Catholic countries like Italy, where divorce was impossible. The Catholic Church taught, or teaches depending on who you ask, that men were the natural heads of families and women should submit to their authority. Women in this time were possessions, not people, and female disobedience was a sin. It was a sign of deep moral corruption. So here we've got this world where women were trapped into marriages with abusive husbands who viewed them as their property. But believe it or not, this was the best of a bad situation. Marriage was often the only viable way for a woman to survive, with limited access to education and almost no ability to earn an independent living. Without a husband, women would have to depend on their fathers or brothers if they even cared to help them, and so marriage provided both financial security and social protection. Unmarried women faced deep stigma as spinsters. They were viewed as burdens or failures. They reflected badly on their families. Society expected women to marry. It was seen as their natural role in life. Marriage and childbearing was their only responsibility on this earth. So if they failed in doing this, they failed in their moral duties. Remaining unmarried and childless might even have been considered to be a sin. So your options as a woman in this time were: 1. Get married to whoever your parents arranged, usually in an attempt to improve social standing. 2. Join a convent. Or 3. Become a spinster, usually having to turn to sex work to survive, because what other way was there to earn money, apart from selling poison? Marriage wasn't just expected in this time, it was the only socially acceptable path. But Giulia Tofana and the existence of her poison finally gave women another choice, and that was becoming a widow. Widowhood was actually one of the few ways that a woman could have a modicum of independence in this time. They'd done their womanly duty, they'd gotten married. It's not their fault if their husband happens to die. And of course, there are a lot of dependents here, class, wealth, family connections, but becoming a widow could often give a woman some degree of legal and financial independence. She could sometimes inherit her husband's property or business. She could manage money and head households. That, of course, was more true for wealthier widows in wealthier families. Poor widows would struggle more without a husband or income, but often they would still find this preferable to marriage, where domestic abuse was very, very rife. Widowhood was one of the very rare ways in which a woman could step outside of male control. It was a loophole in the patriarchy, perhaps. So you can see why so many women would turn to Giulia and her poison. Aquatana, when used correctly, would be impossible to detect, and it would cause a slow death, mimicking many of the other diseases rife at this time. Done correctly, done subtly, a woman would never be suspected of causing her husband's death, especially in the early days before authorities started to hear rumours of what was going on. I mean, a mere woman simply couldn't be expected to have the intelligence to pull off such a thing as poisoning her own husband. The slow death would give a woman enough time to get her husband's affairs in order, to ensure that she was going to be left with the best situation possible. Aquatana for some is viewed as a dangerous weapon, and for others it's a tool of liberation. It was a way to finally give women agency. Poison has historically been considered a woman's weapon. It can easily be administered within the home. It's easy for a woman to prepare food or drinks featuring this poison. It requires less physical strength, no public confrontation, and it's very easy to look accidental, especially in the 17th century. Women of all social classes turned to Aquatana, but one of the most widely believed cases was that of a woman called Maria Aldobrandini, the Duchess of Sicily. It's thought that she used the poison to murder her husband, Francesco Seri, in 1657, but the scandal was very hushed up. Francesco was 30 years older than Maria. He came from a pretty powerful family. Apparently his dad was friends with Galileo, and he was the nephew of a future pope, so he was a pretty big deal. But Maria was even better connected. She came from one of Rome's most powerful families. It's said that she was only 13 years old when she married Francesco, who was in his 40s, and she was only 22 when he died. Maria was said to be incredibly beautiful, and she had fallen in love with another man called Francesco Sentinelli. In a society of arranged marriages, to fall in love was an exciting and rare experience, but especially when your husband is in his 50s and already said to be in poor health. Maria and Sentinelli met, and months later, Seri mysteriously died. But of course, Maria was never going to get her happy ending. Her family locked her up after her husband's death to stop her rushing into a scandalous relationship with Sentinelli, who was said to be a bit of a rape. The reason why we know Maria's story nowadays is because there was a lot of suspicion on her after her husband's death, but undoubtedly her powerful family stopped any actual legal repercussions. So, swings and roundabouts, I suppose. She never got her love. It's hard to know today whether Tofana and Giulia Maspara knew the impact they were having at this time. Like, did they sell this poison knowing they were helping women out of dark situations? Like, was that their intention? Was that how they justified it to themselves? Did they have that level of social awareness? Or was it just a business? Were they in it just for the money? It would have been a lot of money after all. Some evidence does seem to maybe suggest the former. It is said that Spara did sometimes give the poison to women in particularly desperate situations for free. And I can only imagine just how desperate some of these situations were, because how bad have things got to be for you to turn to murder when murder is a better alternative than the reality that you're living, especially in a very Catholic society where they would have believed very strongly in heaven and hell. And also remember that this was the 17th century. The punishments for murder would have been horrific. There were no decent living standards in prison, and that's if they didn't immediately get executed. I mean, Tofana was hung, drawn and quartered. That is horrifying. Giulia Tofana died in 1651, and it doesn't seem like there was any drama surrounding her death. She was never caught for her crimes. She simply died in her bed, it seems. and Girolama continued her legacy, building the Roman network bigger than ever before. Throughout the 1650s, Aquatana was a blight in Rome. There was no shortage of people requesting group services. But as the years went on, authorities started to figure out what was going on, and they were very hot on the poisoner's tail. It's reported that Spara boasted at one point that she'd given this liquid to more people than I've got hairs on my head, and it's rumoured there were at least 600 victims, and if you ask me, that number seems low. Girolama Spara, it seems, was a pretty smart businesswoman. Alongside being a poisoner, she also had a career as an astrologer. She predicted the future and helped people find their missing objects. In doing so, she found herself very closely involved with the Roman aristocracy. She rubbed shoulders with some of the biggest names in the city, which is a good network of people to know if you're a poisoner, both in terms of clients and in the hope that one day they might be able to help. Not that they were much help in the end. In January 1659, one of Spara's poison sellers, Giovanna de Grandis, was arrested and interrogated for her crimes, at which point she named Spara. She was swiftly arrested and taken to prison, where she herself was interrogated repeatedly for months. She always denied any involvement in the crimes and was apparently very smart with her answers. It's said that she talked a lot in interrogations, but she only ever provided completely inconsequential information. She even lied to a priest, which was a big scandal for Catholics. But then again, so is murder, so maybe that didn't mean much to her. Her refusal to confess caused a problem for the authorities because laws at the time meant that she couldn't be executed. You couldn't be executed in this time unless you confessed to the crime, which you would think would be a good thing, but it just meant that interrogation techniques were pretty rough. Eventually, the entire poisoner network was arrested and they all confessed, bar Spara. That was until the 20th of June. She'd been in prison for 5 months when she finally signed a statement of guilt. Just 15 days later, on the 5th of July 1659, Spara and 4 of her business associates were executed, despite never having actually killed anyone directly. Although the investigation into this poison network went well into the next year, no one else was ever convicted for these crimes. Despite potentially hundreds of women buying these poisons, none of them were convicted of the crime of murder, or at least not connected to this particular investigation. And I found that fascinating, but I think it comes down to the network being the masterminds. They were the source of the evil. They were touched by the devil. They were sinners. Women in general were seen as very weak, very easily manipulated, and they were thought of as victims themselves of Spara and her band of poison sellers. Plus, the amount of women from respectable families who were suspected of using this poison was astronomical. Convicting and executing all of these women would have caused unimaginable chaos. It would put the entire balance of Rome off. Many of these women came from noble or wealthy households. They were probably closely linked with the authorities. Imagine the embarrassment of the powerful families and, more importantly, the church if they were convicted of murder. By just blaming the poison network, they could condemn the act of poisoning as a whole without destabilising the entire Roman society. And also, if they outed just how many women used Aquatana, they would be highlighting just how flawed the patriarchy was, just how many women were unhappy with their situations. Still to this day, patriarchal societies are in a delicate tightrope situation. If you give the powerless people a platform, the entire system just starts to crumble. You can't have women out in public saying they killed their husbands to make their lives better because their lives were so awful when so closely connected to men. They can't do that. Everything would just fall apart around them. So, Giulia Tofana, Girolamo Spara, Aquatana, were they heroes or were they villains? It's very easy to argue they were villains. They provided people with poisons that they knew would be used to kill people. It was illegal. As much as we can sit here and argue that they were helping powerless women in impossible situations, they were most likely motivated by money first, and they caused 600, probably-ish, deaths. But on the other hand, they helped so many women live fuller, happy lives. A huge amount of men who died were abusive. They also committed what would be considered as crimes today, but they likely weren't crimes at the time. I always say you can't judge history by modern day standards, but also, Abuse is abuse, no matter if that happened today or 400 years ago. The question is, I suppose, how you weigh the two. How do you weigh the morality of their methods versus the injustice of the world? If the patriarchy didn't lead to such horrific life situations for these women, then maybe the men wouldn't be murdered. You know what? I blame the patriarchy. When in doubt, blame the patriarchy is my motto, and it has never rung truer than in this very exact moment. I'm going to be absolutely fascinated to hear all of your thoughts and feelings about this case in the comments. I have no doubt it is going to be a very divisive one. I don't know where I lay the blame, but I think blaming the patriarchy is as good an option as any, so I'm going with that. Patriarchy's fault, always. Any problem in the world? It's down to the patriarchy. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and a huge thank you to Lilo for partnering with me on this video as well. As I always say, I could not continue to make videos on this channel if I didn't have amazing brands to partner with me and help me out. So make sure you go and show your support by clicking on the link. You can use my code GF15 for 15% off anything on the website, including sale items. You can stack different promotions. You could save yourself so much money. I love Lilo so much. I love what they stand for as a brand, and I would really appreciate your support. They would also really appreciate your support. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.